The night the prairie burned would forever be etched in Hannah Elwood's memory, as both the moment she nearly died and the night her life truly began. Flames rose like angry spirits against the darkening Colorado sky, transforming the peaceful grassland into a nightmarish inferno that showed no mercy as it devoured everything in its path. Hannah clutched her satchel of medicines to her chest, her lungs burning with each ragged breath as she ran. The hem of her skirt had already caught fire twice, forcing her to beat out the flames with her bare hands. As the town's only female physician in Colorado City, she had ventured out to the Jackson homestead to deliver their baby, never imagining that a cooking fire would spread so violently across the drought-stricken land. "Keep moving," she shouted to herself, her voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. The smoke was growing thicker, disorienting her as she struggled to find the path back to town. The Jacksons had evacuated with their newborn son, taking the only horse they owned and promising to send help. But help seemed a distant hope now as the circle of fire closed in around her. Her lungs screamed for clean air. Hannah stumbled, falling to her knees in the tall grass not yet consumed by flames. The smoke was so dense she could hardly see more than a few feet ahead. Death felt close now, breathing down her neck with hot, acrid breath. Then she heard its hoofbeats pounding against the earth, coming fast. At first, she thought it was just the blood rushing in her ears, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. Hannah forced herself to her feet, waving her arms frantically above her head. "Here!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "I'm here!" Through a wall of flames, he came like an apparition, a man on horseback, his duster billowing behind him as he urged his mount through the fire. The horse, a powerful chestnut stallion, reared and whinnied in protest, but obeyed its master's commands. In the orange glow of the inferno, Hannah could see the determination etched on the rider's face, a face half hidden by a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. Without slowing, he leaned down, one arm extended toward her. "Take my hand," he shouted, his voice rough from the smoke. Hannah didn't hesitate. As he thundered past, she reached up and felt his iron grip close around her wrist. With strength that seemed impossible, he pulled her up and onto the saddle behind him in one fluid motion. "Hold on tight," he commanded, and Hannah wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against his back as they charged through the wall of fire. The heat was unbearable, the smoke suffocating. Hannah closed her eyes, certain they would both perish in the attempt, but the horse never faltered and neither did its rider. They burst through the flames into a pocket of clearer air, and Hannah risked opening her eyes to see the town of Colorado City in the distance, silhouetted against the night sky. "We're going to make it," the stranger called over his shoulder. "Just keep holding on." And Hannah did, her fingers digging into the rough material of his shirt, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her hands. In that moment, with death so close behind them and the unknown ahead, Hannah Elwood knew nothing would ever be the same again. As they thundered toward the safety of town, the wind shifted, carrying the stranger's bandana away from his face. In the moonlight breaking through the smoke, Hannah caught a glimpse of a strong jawline, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a scar that ran along his right cheekbone. "Who are you?" she whispered, but her words were lost to the night, carried away by the wind and the rhythmic pounding of hooves as they raced toward salvation. The man guided his horse expertly through the outskirts of Colorado City, away from the approaching fire, and toward the center of town, where people were gathering with wagons and belongings, preparing to evacuate if necessary. The local sheriff and a group of men were organizing a firefighting effort, filling buckets from the town well and preparing to defend the buildings if the wind should shift again. When they reached the town square, the stranger finally slowed his horse to a stop. Hannah's arms were still locked around his waist, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. "You can let go now, madam," he said gently. "You're safe." Hannah reluctantly loosened her grip and allowed him to help her down from the saddle. Her legs buckled beneath her, and he caught her before she could fall, strong hands steadying her shoulders. "Thank you," she managed, her voice raw from the smoke. "You saved my life." Now that they stood face to face, Hannah could see him clearly for the first time. He was tall, with broad shoulders that tapered to a lean waist. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but she guessed him to be no more than 30. Those storm-gray eyes regarded her with concern, and when he smiled, the scar on his cheek curved with it. "Couldn't leave you out there," he said simply. "Name's Hank Edwards." "Hannah Elwood," she replied, extending a hand that was still blackened with soot. "I'm the physician here in Colorado City." Surprise flickered across his face. "A lady doctor, that's not something you see every day." Before Hannah could respond, Sheriff Mills pushed through the gathering crowd, his weathered face creased with worry. "Doc Elwood, thank the Lord. The Jacksons came tearing into town saying you were still out there. I was just gathering men to go looking for you." "This man found me first," Hannah said, turning to introduce her rescuer, but Hank Edwards had stepped back, his expression suddenly guarded. Sheriff Mills's eyes narrowed as he took in the stranger. "I know you," he said slowly. "You're that drifter who's been camping outside of town. Been wondering what your business is around here." "Just passing through," Hank said, his voice neutral. "Saw the fire and thought I might lend a hand." "Well, you did more than that," the sheriff acknowledged, though suspicion still lingered in his eyes. "You saved our doctor." Hannah frowned at the sheriff's tone. "He rode straight through the flames to reach me, Sheriff. I'd be dead if not for his courage." The sheriff nodded reluctantly. "Then we owe you our thanks, Mr. Edwards, but this fire's going to need every able body to keep it from reaching town." "You willing to help with that too?" "I'll do what I can," Hank replied. "Good. Report to Deputy Wilson over by the livery. He's organizing the bucket brigade." The sheriff turned back to Hannah. "You should get yourself to the hotel, Doc, Mrs. Peterson set it up as a place for folks who have had to leave their homes. You look like you could use some rest, and there might be people needing your help." Hannah wanted to protest. She wanted to stay near the man who had saved her, but the sheriff was right. Her medical skills might be needed, and she was barely standing as it was. "I'll head there directly," she agreed, then turned to Hank. "Mr. Edwards, I don't know how to thank you properly." "No need," he said, already backing toward his horse. "Just doing what anyone would." But they both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have ridden into an inferno to save a stranger. As Hank Edwards mounted his horse and rode toward the livery, Hannah couldn't help but feel there was more to this drifter than met the eye. The way the sheriff had looked at him, the way Hank had withdrawn at the first sign of official attention. There was a story there, one she found herself suddenly desperate to know. But for now, there were others who needed her. With one last glance at the retreating figure of her rescuer, Hannah Elwood gathered what strength remained and made her way to the hotel, the taste of smoke still bitter on her tongue, and the memory of strong arms pulling her to safety still fresh in her mind. The Prairie Hotel bustled with activity as Hannah pushed through the doors. Women were laying out blankets on the lobby floor while children huddled in corners, wide-eyed and frightened. The smell of smoke clung to everyone, a reminder of the danger still threatening their town. Dr. Elwood. Prudence Davis, the hotel owner's daughter, rushed forward. Her normally perfectly coiffed blonde hair was falling from its pins, and her blue dress was smudged with soot. "We heard you were caught in the fire. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, Prue," Hannah assured her, though her scorched hands and smoke-roughened voice suggested otherwise. "Just need some water and a moment to catch my breath. Then I'll see to anyone who needs medical attention." Prudence ushered her to a chair and quickly fetched a glass of water. "The Robinsons have some burns, nothing too serious, and old Mr. Jenkins is having trouble breathing from all the smoke. Mrs. Jackson and the baby are resting upstairs, though they seem to be doing well despite everything." Hannah nodded, gulping down the water gratefully. "What's the news about the fire?" "The men think they can keep it from reaching town if the wind holds," Prudence said, refilling Hannah's glass. "Most of the farms to the east have been evacuated. Some folks lost everything." Her voice wavered. "It's horrible, Hannah, just horrible." Hannah squeezed her friend's hand. "We'll get through this, Prue. Colorado City has weathered worse." After a few minutes of rest, Hannah retrieved her medical bag miraculously intact despite her ordeal and began making rounds among the displaced townspeople. She treated minor burns, smoke inhalation, and tried to calm frayed nerves. The work was a welcome distraction from her own harrowing experience, though she found her thoughts continually drifting back to the man who had saved her life. It was past midnight when the hotel doors opened again, admitting a group of exhausted firefighters. Their faces were blackened with soot, clothes singed and damp from sweat. Among them was Hank Edwards, looking as weary as the rest but somehow still commanding attention as he entered the room. His eyes found Hannah immediately, and something like relief flickered across his features. Hannah excused herself from the elderly woman whose arm she was bandaging and made her way to him. "Mr. Edwards," she said formally, aware of the curious glances from the townspeople. "Are you injured?" "Nothing worth mentioning," he replied, though she noticed him favoring his right arm. "I'll be the judge of that," she said firmly. "Sit down and let me take a look." To her surprise, he complied without argument, sinking onto a wooden chair in the corner of the lobby. When he removed his shirt at her instruction, Hannah had to work to maintain her professional demeanor. His torso was lean and muscled, bronzed by the sun except for an angry red burn that stretched across his right shoulder. "This needs attention," she said, keeping her voice steady as she rummaged in her bag for salve and bandages. "It could easily become infected." "Had worse," he muttered, but submitted to her ministrations. As Hannah gently applied the salve to his burned skin, she asked quietly, "How does the fire look now?" "Under control, mostly," Hank answered. "Wind shifted in our favor. Town's safe, though there's still some cleanup to do come morning." He winced slightly as her fingers touched a particularly tender spot. "Sorry about your hands." Hannah glanced down at her own reddened palms. "Occupational hazard," she said with a small smile, "though usually from delivering babies, not running from prairie fires." "You're not what I expected from a frontier doctor," Hank observed, studying her face. "And what did you expect, Mr. Edwards?" "Some grizzled old man with a whiskey bottle in one hand and a rusty saw in the other," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. Hannah laughed despite herself. "Sorry to disappoint you." "Oh, I'm not disappointed, Doc. Not in the least." The way he looked at her then made Hannah's cheeks warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire or her exertions. She busied herself with bandaging his shoulder, trying to ignore the firm muscle beneath her fingers and the way his breath caught when she leaned closer. "There," she said at last, securing the bandage. "You should change this tomorrow, and try not to use that arm too much for a few days." "Yes, madam," Hank said, though something in his tone suggested he had little intention of following her advice. He pulled his shirt back on but made no move to leave his chair. "You planning to take care of everybody else before yourself?" Hannah blinked in surprise. "I'm fine." Your hands are burned, you've been breathing smoke for hours, and you look ready to collapse, Hank pointed out. Who doctors the doctor in this town? Before Hannah could answer, Sheriff Mills entered the hotel, his weary face brightening when he spotted her. Doc, good news, fire's contained. Should be completely out by morning. His gaze shifted to Hank and his expression cooled noticeably. Edwards, you heading out now that the excitement's over? Hank stood slowly, his face unreadable. Not just yet, Sheriff. Thought I might stick around, help with the cleanup. That's so. The sheriff's tone was skeptical. Well, don't get too comfortable. Small towns have long memories even if it's been a few years. Hannah frowned, looking between the two men. Sheriff Mills, what exactly? Nothing for you to worry about, Doc, the sheriff cut her off. Just old business. He tipped his hat to her. You should get some rest. Morning's going to come mighty early, and there'll be plenty of work for everyone. With that, he moved away, stopping to speak with other townspeople and checking on the welfare of those who had been displaced by the fire. Hannah turned back to Hank, questions burning on her tongue, but he was already backing toward the door. Your sheriff's right about one thing, he said. You need rest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, pressing it into her hand. Found this when we were fighting the fire. Thought it might be yours. Hannah looked down to find her father's pocket watch in her palm, the one she'd believed lost in her flight from the flames. The gold case was tarnished by smoke but intact, the initials TE still clearly visible on the cover. How did you know this was mine? She asked, clutching the watch tightly. Hank shrugged his uninjured shoulder. Elwood, TE, took a guess it might be family. It was my father's, Hannah said softly. Thank you for returning it. It means a great deal to me, figured as much. Hank touched the brim of his hat in a casual salute. Get some sleep, Doc. I'll see you around. As he turned to leave, Hannah called after him, Mr. Edwards. Where are you staying tonight? He paused, looking back at her with those storm-gray eyes. Got my bedroll at the livery. Horse needs looking after anyway. But your burn will heal just fine, thanks to your doctoring. His expression softened slightly. Don't worry about me, Hannah Elwood. I've been taking care of myself for a long time. With that, he was gone, slipping out into the night and leaving Hannah with more questions than answers. Her father's watch warm in her hand, and the memory of his touch still tingling on her skin. Dawn broke over Colorado City with a sky mercifully clear of smoke. The fire had been fully contained during the night, though the scent of burning still hung in the air like a lingering threat. Hannah had managed a few hours of fitful sleep on a cot in the hotel's small office, her dreams filled with flames and the thundering of hooves. She rose early, splashing her face with water from the basin and wincing as it touched her burned hands. After rebandaging them as best she could, she twisted her dark hair into a simple knot at the nape of her neck, and donned the spare dress Prudence had loaned her. Her own clothes were ruined beyond saving, still reeking of smoke and singed in several places. The hotel lobby was quieter now, many of the displaced townspeople having found lodging with friends or relatives. Those who remained were beginning to stir, preparing to face the task of rebuilding what the fire had destroyed. Hannah checked on her patients from the night before, relieved to find them all recovering well. Mrs. Jackson and her newborn son were preparing to leave with relatives who lived in town, the baby seemingly unaffected by the dramatic circumstances of his first day of life. We can never thank you enough, Dr. Elwood, Mrs. Jackson said, clutching Hannah's hand, for delivering our Thomas safely and for risking your life to stay with us until we could evacuate. I was just doing my job, Hannah assured her, and I'm glad that handsome boy of yours is thriving despite all the excitement. After making sure everyone was stable, Hannah stepped outside into the morning light. The town appeared largely unchanged, saved from the flames by the efforts of its citizens and the fortunate shift in the wind. But in the distance, to the east where the Jackson farm and others lay, she could see the blackened remains of the prairie, a stark reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Hannah made her way to her small medical office, relieved to find it untouched by the fire. She gathered fresh supplies and prepared to head out to the affected farms to offer medical assistance to those who might need it. As she was loading her bag into a small wagon borrowed from the livery, she heard the now familiar voice behind her. "Planning on another rescue mission, Doc." Hannah turned to find Hank Edwards leading his chestnut stallion down the street toward her. In the clear light of morning, she could see him properly for the first time. His dark hair was in need of a trim, falling across his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to brush it back. The scar on his cheek was more pronounced in daylight, a thin white line that spoke of some past violence. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt, denim trousers, and worn boots, but carried himself with an easy confidence that set him apart from the other men in town. "Mr. Edwards," she greeted him, trying to ignore the quickening of her pulse. "How's your shoulder this morning?" "Still attached," he replied with that half-smile that seemed to transform his face. "Where are you headed?" "Out to the farms to check on those who couldn't make it to town. Some may have injuries they couldn't tend to in the chaos of evacuation." Hank nodded, his expression turning serious. "Shouldn't go alone. The ground's still hot in places and there could be flare-ups." "Are you offering to escort me, Mr. Edwards?" Hannah asked, raising an eyebrow. "Seems the least I could do, considering I went to all the trouble of saving you yesterday," he said, the teasing note in his voice belied by the genuine concern in his eyes. "Besides, I know which areas are safe to travel through. Spent most of the night out there with the fire crews." Hannah considered his offer. Common sense told her to be wary of this stranger with his guarded eyes and the tension between him and the sheriff. But something deeper, something she couldn't quite name, made her trust him despite the mysteries surrounding him. "Very well," she agreed. "But I insist on checking your burn first, and properly this time." Hank submitted to her examination without protest, sitting on a bench outside her office while she carefully removed the bandage from the night before. The burn looked better than she'd feared, red and painful, certainly, but showing no signs of infection. "You were lucky," she told him as she applied fresh salve. "This could have been much worse." "Wasn't luck," Hank said quietly. "Was good riding and better instincts. Horse knew how to move through fire without getting caught." Hannah's hand stilled for a moment. "You've done this before, ridden through fires." Hank's expression closed off slightly. "Once or twice. Prairie fires aren't exactly rare out here. And rescuing damsels in distress." "Is that a regular occurrence as well?" That earned her another smile, this one reaching his eyes. "First time for that particular adventure, Doc, though I can't say I regret it." Hannah finished bandaging his shoulder and stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had been standing. "Well, if you're still offering that escort, I'd be grateful for the company." They set out within the hour, Hannah driving the wagon while Hank rode alongside on his stallion. The damage from the fire became more apparent as they traveled east out of town. What had been golden prairie grass was now a blackened wasteland stretching to the horizon, the occasional farm standing like an island in a sea of ash where the men had managed to save the buildings by creating fire breaks. Their first stop was the Miller farm, where the family had lost their barn but saved their home and livestock. Hannah treated Mr. Miller for minor burns and his wife for smoke inhalation, while Hank helped their teenage sons shore up a damaged section of fencing. "That man with you, Mrs. Miller said quietly as Hannah listened to her breathing. "He looks familiar somehow." He's new in town, Hannah replied. At least I think he is. I only met him yesterday when he rescued me from the fire. Mrs. Miller's eyes widened. Rescued you? My goodness, Doctor, you've had quite an adventure. More than I'd prefer, Hannah admitted with a small smile, but I'm grateful to be alive thanks to Mr. Edwards. They continued their rounds throughout the morning, visiting 3 more farms before stopping to rest in the shade of a cottonwood tree that had somehow survived the fire. Hannah shared the lunch Prudence had packed for them: bread, cheese, and apples, while Hank watered the horses from a nearby stream. You're good with people, Hank observed as he sat down beside her. They trust you. I've been the doctor here for 2 years, Hannah replied. Before that, I assisted my father in his practice in Denver. Medicine is all I've ever wanted to do. Can't be easy being a woman doctor in these parts. Hannah's lips quirked into a wry smile. It wasn't at first. When my father died and I came to take over his friend's practice here, most folks were skeptical. Some still won't let me treat them, preferring to ride 30 miles to the next town for a male physician. But I've proven myself, one patient at a time. Your father taught you, he did. He was progressive in his thinking. Believed women could be just as capable as men in medicine. He even managed to get me some formal training back east, though they wouldn't grant me a proper degree. Hank studied her with those penetrating eyes. Must have been a remarkable man. He was, Hannah said softly, touching the pocket watch she now kept in her dress pocket. What about you, Mr. Edwards? What brings you to Colorado City? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Just passing through, he said finally, the same words he'd used with the sheriff. Been working my way north from Texas, taking odd jobs along the way. And before Texas, his eyes met hers, unreadable. Does it matter? I suppose not, Hannah conceded. Except that the sheriff seems to know you, and not in a friendly way. Hank's jaw tightened. Mills has me confused with someone else. It was clearly a lie, but Hannah decided not to press further. Whatever history existed between Hank Edwards and Sheriff Mills, it wasn't her place to force a confidence. They finished their meal in companionable silence, then continued on to the last 2 farms on Hannah's list. By late afternoon, they were heading back toward town, both tired but satisfied with the day's work. The wagon bumped along the rutted path, and Hannah found herself stealing glances at her companion as he rode beside her, his profile strong against the backdrop of the setting sun. Thank you for coming with me today, she said as the first buildings of Colorado City came into view. Your help was invaluable. Happy to be of service, Doc, he replied, tipping his hat, though I'm not sure how useful I really was. You were excellent with the Miller boys, and you practically rebuilt the Hendersons' chicken coop single-handedly, Hannah pointed out. Not to mention keeping me company on what could have been a very lonely journey. Hank's expression softened. Well, when you put it that way. They rode in silence for a few more minutes before Hannah gathered her courage to ask, Will you be staying in Colorado City long? He hesitated, his eyes scanning the town ahead. Not sure yet. Depends on a few things. The sheriff being one of them, Hannah ventured. Hank shot her a sidelong glance. You don't give up easily, do you, Doc? It's been mentioned as one of my less endearing qualities, she admitted with a small smile. I wouldn't call it that, he said quietly. Then, after a moment's consideration, tell you what. Have dinner with me tonight and I'll answer your questions, some of them anyway. Hannah's heart skipped a beat. Dinner, at the hotel, nothing improper, just a meal and conversation. There was a hint of vulnerability in his eyes now that she hadn't seen before. Unless you'd rather not be seen socially with a drifter of questionable reputation. I'd like that very much, Mr. Edwards, Hannah replied, surprising herself with her own boldness. Though I should warn you, in a town this size, people will talk. Let them, Hank said with a shrug. I've been the subject of worse gossip. As they reached the edge of town, Hannah couldn't help but wonder what exactly she was getting herself into. But the memory of Hank charging through flames to reach her, of his steady presence throughout the day, overcame any misgivings. Whatever his past held, she wanted to know more of the man who had risked his life for a stranger and who looked at her as if she were something rare and precious. Evening found Hannah standing before the small mirror in her bedroom above the medical office, studying her reflection with critical eyes. She had bathed away the last remnants of smoke and ash, washing her hair with lavender-scented soap and letting it dry in loose waves that framed her face. The blue dress she wore was one of her few concessions to fashion, with its fitted bodice and modestly scooped neckline. It was still practical by Eastern standards, but in Colorado City, it qualified as finery. "This is merely dinner," she told her reflection sternly. "With a man you barely know, who may well be gone tomorrow." But the fluttering in her stomach belied her practical words. There was something about Hank Edwards that called to her, a connection she couldn't explain but couldn't deny either. Perhaps it was simply the intensity of their first meeting, the life and death circumstances that had thrown them together. Or perhaps it was something more, something that made her pulse quicken whenever he was near. The Prairie Hotel's dining room was busy when Hannah arrived, many of the town's residents still taking meals there while repairs continued on homes damaged in the fire. She spotted Hank immediately, seated at a corner table away from the main crowd. He stood as she approached, and Hannah noticed he'd made an effort with his appearance as well. His hair was neatly combed, his shirt clean and pressed, and he'd traded his trail-worn coat for a dark jacket that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. "You look beautiful, Doc," he said simply as he held her chair. "Hannah," she corrected him with a smile, "if we're dining together, you might as well use my given name." "Hannah," he repeated, and something about the way he said it made her cheeks warm. "And I suppose you should call me Hank instead of Mr. Edwards." "Hank," she tested the name. "Is that short for Henry?" "Harrison, actually," he admitted as he retook his seat. "But no one's called me that in years." They ordered dinner beefsteak with potatoes and greens. Simple fare but well prepared, and initially kept their conversation to safe topics. The condition of the patients they'd visited that day, the progress of the fire cleanup, and Hannah's observations about Colorado City and its inhabitants. It wasn't until they were lingering over coffee that Hannah finally broached the subject that had been hanging between them all evening. "You promised me answers, Hank." He met her gaze steadily. "Some answers. Ask your questions and I'll tell you what I can." Hannah considered where to begin. "How does Sheriff Mills know you?" Hank took a sip of his coffee before responding. "I was in Colorado City once before, about 3 years ago. Wasn't here long, but long enough to have a disagreement with Mills." "What kind of disagreement?" A shadow crossed Hank's face. "The kind that ends with a man in jail. I was accused of something I didn't do, spent 2 weeks behind bars before they figured out they had the wrong man." His fingers tightened around his cup. "Mills never did apologize, just opened the cell and told me to get out of his town." "That's horrible," Hannah said, instinctively reaching across the table to touch his hand. "What were you accused of?" Hank hesitated, his eyes searching hers as if gauging whether she could handle the truth. "Robbery," he said finally. "The stagecoach to Denver was held up, driver killed. I happened to be passing through, a stranger with no alibi, made a convenient suspect. But they realized you were innocent, eventually. Real culprits were caught in Boulder with the stolen money and a distinctive watch that had belonged to one of the passengers." He shrugged. "By then, though, the damage was done. Small towns have long memories, like Mills said. Hannah absorbed this, trying to reconcile it with the man sitting across from her. Is that why you've been staying outside of town? Because of what happened before? Partly, Hank acknowledged. And partly because I'm not much for company most times. Prefer the open air to four walls. Where are you from originally? Hannah asked, sensing he was becoming more comfortable with her questions. Missouri, originally. Grew up on a small farm near Independence. Left when I was 18, been moving ever since. Family, his expression shuddered slightly. Parents died in '68, influenza. No brothers or sisters. I'm sorry, Hannah said softly. I lost my mother when I was 12 and my father just 2 years ago. I know how it feels to be alone. Something in Hank's eyes softened at that. Seems we have that in common then. He paused, then asked, what brought you to Colorado City? Must have been other places that would welcome a doctor more readily than a frontier town. My father's friend practiced here for 30 years. When his hands grew too arthritic to continue, he wrote to my father asking if he knew anyone who might take over. My father had just died, and I needed a fresh start. Hannah smiled ruefully. I thought people might be more willing to accept a female physician in a place desperate for any medical care at all. Smart thinking. It wasn't easy at first, Hannah admitted. Some folks still call me nurse despite my corrections. But the women accepted me quickly, especially for childbirth and women's complaints. The men have been slower to come around, but even the most stubborn will seek help when they're hurting badly enough. Hank studied her with genuine admiration. Takes courage to forge your own path like that. Most women would have married and settled for a conventional life. I'm not most women, Hannah said, meeting his gaze directly. No, Hank agreed, his voice dropping lower. You certainly are not Hannah Elwood. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither of them was quite ready to name. Hannah broke the tension first, glancing away to check the clock on the wall. It's getting late, she said, though she felt no real desire to end their evening. May I walk you home? Hank interrupted, rising to pull out her chair. The simple courtesy, so at odds with his rugged appearance, made Hannah smile. I'd like that. They left the hotel together, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, untainted by smoke for the first time in days. The main street was quiet, most businesses closed for the night, though light and music spilled from the saloon at the far end of town. They walked in companionable silence, Hank matching his long stride to Hannah's more modest pace. When they reached her office with its attached living quarters, Hannah found herself reluctant to say good night. Thank you for dinner, she said, turning to face him on the small porch. And for the conversation, it's been refreshing to talk with someone new. Been my pleasure, Hank replied, his voice rumbling low in the darkness. Been a long time since I had such good company. Hannah hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind all evening. Will you be leaving Colorado City soon? Hank was quiet for a moment, his face half in shadow. Thought I might stay a while, he said finally. There's work to be done rebuilding after the fire. And he trailed off, looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. And I find I'm not in such a hurry to move on as I was before. I'm glad, Hannah said softly, surprising herself with her honesty. I'd like the chance to know you better, Hank Edwards. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. That works out well, he murmured, since I find myself wanting the same thing. For a breathless moment, Hannah thought he might kiss her. Part of her, a larger part than she cared to admit, hoped he would. But Hank merely reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers gentle against her cheek. Good night, Hannah, he said, stepping back. I'll see you tomorrow, "Tomorrow," she agreed, her voice not quite steady. "Good night, Hank." As she watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness, Hannah pressed a hand to her cheek where his fingers had touched. Whatever was growing between them, whatever this connection was, she knew it was unlike anything she had experienced before. And despite all the unanswered questions, despite the wariness that common sense demanded, Hannah found herself looking forward to tomorrow with an eagerness that both thrilled and terrified her. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Colorado City began to recover from the fire. Hannah's days were filled with treating patients and helping coordinate relief efforts for those who had lost homes and livelihoods. To her surprise and pleasure, Hank became a constant presence, lending his strength and skills wherever they were needed most. He proved to be a jack of all trades, skilled with carpentry, knowledgeable about livestock, and possessed of seemingly endless stamina when it came to the heavy labor of rebuilding. The townspeople, initially wary of the quiet stranger, gradually warmed to him as they witnessed his tireless work. Even Sheriff Mills maintained a grudging truce, though his suspicious glances made it clear he hadn't forgotten the past. Hannah and Hank fell into an easy rhythm together. He would often accompany her on her rounds to outlying farms, riding beside her wagon and helping with whatever tasks arose. In the evenings, they would share dinner at the hotel or sometimes a simple meal at Hannah's home when she was too tired to venture out again. During these quiet moments together, they gradually shared more of themselves. Hannah told Hank about her childhood in Denver, her father's encouragement of her medical ambitions, and her struggles to be taken seriously in a profession dominated by men. Hank spoke of his years of wandering, working cattle drives in Texas, panning for gold in California, and even a brief stint as a deputy marshal in Wyoming Territory. "Why did you leave that job?" Hannah asked one evening as they sat on her small porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Being a lawman seems like it would provide more stability than drifting." Hank's expression grew distant. "Had a partner, good man named Frank. We were tracking a gang that had robbed a bank in Cheyenne. Caught up to them in a canyon, thought we had the advantage." He paused, his jaw tightening at the memory. "We were wrong. Frank took a bullet meant for me, died in my arms before help could arrive." Hannah reached over to touch his hand, understanding the burden of such a memory. "I'm sorry, Hank. That's a terrible thing to carry." "Turned in my badge the next day," Hank continued after a moment. "Couldn't stomach the thought of partnering with someone else, of maybe being responsible for another man's death. So I went back to drifting. Seemed easier that way, no attachments, no one counting on me, no one to let down." "And now," Hannah asked softly, "is that still what you want?" "A life without attachments." Hank's eyes met hers, storm gray and intense in the fading light. "Not sure anymore," he admitted. "Finding myself thinking differently these days." The air between them hummed with possibility, with words unspoken but increasingly difficult to deny. Each day, Hannah found herself falling deeper under the spell of this complex, gentle man with his quiet strength and unexpected tenderness. And each day, she saw in his eyes that he was fighting a similar battle, drawn to her but wary of what it might mean. Their first kiss happened on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks after the fire. They had ridden out to one of the recovering homesteads to deliver medicines and check on a young boy who had been injured helping his father fight the flames. On the ride back to town, Hank suggested they take a detour to see how the prairie was recovering from the burn. "Nature's resilient," he told her as they dismounted in an area that had been completely blackened just days before. "Look closely." Hannah knelt beside him, marveling at the tiny green shoots already pushing through the ash-covered soil. Life returning already, she murmured. It's amazing. Fire can be cleansing, Hank said, running his fingers gently over the delicate new growth. Destroys what's there, but makes way for something new to begin. When Hannah looked up at him, she found his eyes on her face, filled with an emotion that made her heart race. Without conscious thought, she leaned toward him, and he met her halfway. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, a question being asked and answered. Then his hand came up to cradle her face, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent, more consuming. Hannah felt as though she were falling and flying simultaneously, anchored only by the solid warmth of him against her. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Hank rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since the night we met," he confessed. "Why didn't you?" Hannah asked, her fingers curled in the fabric of his shirt. "Wasn't sure you'd welcome it," he said with a small smile, "and I didn't want to rush you into something you might regret." "I don't regret this," she assured him, her voice steady despite the tumult of emotions inside her. "Not at all." After that day, something shifted between them. Their time together took on a new dimension, filled with stolen kisses and lingering touches that spoke of deeper feelings neither was quite ready to name aloud. The people of Colorado City noticed the change. Of course, in a town that's small, little remained private for long, but most seemed to approve of the budding romance between their doctor and the man who had become an unexpected hero during the fire. Only Sheriff Mills continued to view their relationship with open disapproval, going so far as to pull Hannah aside after church one Sunday to express his concerns. "You're a respected member of this community, Doc," he said, his weathered face creased with genuine worry. "And Edwards, well, he's got a past you might not know about. He told me about being falsely accused when he was here before," Hannah replied, keeping her voice low to avoid being overheard by the churchgoers mingling nearby. "Is there something else I should know?" The sheriff hesitated. "Just be careful. Men like that, drifters, they don't usually stay put for long. Don't want to see you hurt when he moves on." Though she bristled at his presumption, Hannah recognized the sheriff's concern came from a place of genuine care. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff, but I'm quite capable of making my own judgments about character." "Never said you weren't," Mills replied. "Just saying sometimes the heart sees what it wants to, not what's really there." The sheriff's warning lingered in Hannah's mind that evening as she and Hank walked along the creek that ran behind the town, enjoying the cool evening air. She found herself studying his profile in the gathering dusk, wondering if there was indeed more to his story that she didn't know. "You're quiet tonight," Hank observed, his hand warm around hers. "Something troubling you?" Hannah hesitated, then decided honesty was the only path forward. "Sheriff Mills spoke to me today. He seems to think you might not be planning to stay in Colorado City." Hank's stride faltered for a moment before he continued walking. "Mills has his opinions." "And what's the truth?" Hannah asked, stopping to face him directly. "I need to know, Hank. What are your intentions? Is this what's between us just a temporary diversion for you?" The hurt that flashed across his face made her regret her blunt words immediately. "Is that what you think of me?" he asked quietly. "That I'd trifle with your feelings and then just ride away?" "No," Hannah said quickly, "but you've spent years drifting, never staying in one place. And I've built a life here, a practice, a home. I can't just leave on a whim and She took a deep breath. "I need to know if we're building towards something real or if I'm setting myself up for heartbreak." Hank was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Truth is, I don't know what the future holds. Never thought much beyond the next town, the next job. Been that way so long I'm not sure I know how to be any other way." Hannah's heart sank, but before she could respond, he continued. "But I do know this," he said, turning to take both her hands in his. "I haven't felt this way about anyone, ever, and the thought of riding away from you—" He shook his head. "Can't imagine doing that, not now, maybe not ever." "What are you saying, Hank?" Hannah asked, hardly daring to hope. "I'm saying I want to try," he answered simply, "to build something here with you if you'll have me." Relief and joy flooded through Hannah. "I want that too," she whispered, "more than anything." He pulled her close then, his arms encircling her as if she were something precious he feared losing. "I can't promise it'll be easy," he murmured against her hair. "Got a lot to learn about staying in one place, about being the kind of man who deserves someone like you." "You already are that man," Hannah told him firmly. "The man who rides through fire to save a stranger. The man who helps rebuild a community without being asked. The man who looks at me and sees who I really am, not just who he thinks I should be." Hank's kiss was tender, filled with a promise neither of them had expected to find in the aftermath of disaster. As they stood together under the vast Colorado sky, Hannah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, this love that had sparked in the midst of prairie fire was strong enough to endure. The following weeks saw a transformation in Hank Edwards that few in Colorado City could have predicted. The drifter who had kept to himself on the outskirts of town became an integral part of the community, taking on work as a general handyman and occasionally helping the livery owner break particularly difficult horses. He rented a small cabin on the edge of town, and though it was sparsely furnished, Hannah noticed he took particular care with the repairs and improvements, as if preparing for a future more permanent than any he had envisioned before. Their courtship progressed with a mixture of old-fashioned propriety and moments of passion that left them both breathless. They were careful to maintain appearances Hannah's position, as the town's physician demanded a certain decorum, but privately, their connection deepened with each passing day. It was Prudence Davis who first noticed the change in the town's attitude toward Hank. "You know," she remarked to Hannah one afternoon as they sorted through donated clothing for fire victims, "people are starting to see Mr. Edwards differently. Mrs. Thompson was saying just yesterday how fortunate we are to have such a skilled carpenter in town, and the Millers have practically adopted him since he fixed their windmill." Hannah smiled, pleased but not surprised. Hank has a way of proving himself through actions rather than words. "And Sheriff Mills?" Prudence asked, her blue eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Has he come around yet?" "Let's just say they've reached an understanding," Hannah replied diplomatically. In truth, the sheriff's relationship with Hank remained cool but civil. There had been a turning point when Hank had helped track down a pair of horse thieves who had targeted the livery, using tracking skills that impressed even Mills. After that, the sheriff seemed less inclined to view Hank as a potential troublemaker, though he maintained a watchful distance. As summer gave way to fall, Hannah began to wonder if Hank might be considering a more permanent commitment. They had spoken of the future in general terms, but neither had broached the subject of marriage directly. Hannah found herself thinking of it more frequently, imagining a life shared with this man who had so unexpectedly captured her heart. The opportunity to discuss it came on an October evening, when they rode out to the spot where the prairie fire had nearly claimed Hannah's life. The land had recovered remarkably, covered now in fresh grass interspersed with late-blooming wildflowers that swayed in the gentle breeze. "Hard to believe this is the same place," Hannah mused as they spread a blanket for a picnic supper. "Nature is truly miraculous in its ability to heal." "People too," Hank said, his eyes on her face. "Sometimes all it takes is the right circumstances, the right person to help the healing along." Hannah smiled, recognizing that he was speaking of more than the land. Are you saying I've been a good influence on you, Mr. Edwards? The best, he replied with such sincerity that it took her breath away. You've shown me there's more to life than just moving from place to place, never putting down roots. And you don't miss the freedom of that life? Hannah asked. The open road, answering to no one. Hank considered this, his gaze sweeping across the vast prairie stretching to the horizon. Freedom's a funny thing, he said finally. Used to think it meant not being tied down, not having anyone depending on me. Now I'm starting to think maybe true freedom is having a place to belong, people worth coming home to. His words filled Hannah with hope. And have you found that here? A place to belong? I have, Hank said, turning to face her fully. But it's not so much the place as the person. Hannah's heart began to race as Hank reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. When he opened his hand, she saw a simple gold ring resting on his palm. This was my mother's, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Only thing I kept when I left home. Been carrying it all these years, never thought I'd have a use for it. He took a deep breath. Hannah Elwood, I love you, more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Tears sprang to Hannah's eyes, joy expanding in her chest until she thought it might burst. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Hank, I love you too. The ring fit perfectly, a simple band that represented a promise neither of them had expected to make or receive. As Hank pulled her into his arms, sealing their engagement with a kiss that spoke of both tenderness and passion, Hannah knew that the prairie fire that had nearly taken her life had instead given her the greatest gift imaginable, a love born in flames, tested by adversity, and stronger for having survived. The news of their engagement spread through Colorado City like wildfire, met with general approval, and a few raised eyebrows from those who still viewed Hank as an outsider. Prudence Davis immediately volunteered to help with wedding preparations, and several of Hannah's patients offered everything from handmade quilts to preserved fruits as engagement gifts. They set the date for early December, wanting a small ceremony before the worst of winter set in. Hannah wrote to her father's sister in Denver, inviting her to attend, while Hank admitted there was no family left for him to notify. You're my family now, he told her one evening as they sat before the fire in Hannah's small parlor. You and whatever future we build together. As the wedding approached, Hannah found herself busier than ever, balancing her medical practice with preparations for the ceremony and for joining her life with Hank's. They had decided to live in her home above the medical office, which was more comfortable than Hank's small cabin and conveniently located for her work. The only shadow on their happiness came in mid-November, when a telegram arrived for Hank. Hannah was tending to a patient when he received it, and by the time she returned home that evening, she could sense immediately that something was wrong. Hank sat at her kitchen table, his expression troubled, the telegram spread before him. What is it? Hannah asked, her heart clenching with sudden fear. Bad news. Hank looked up, his eyes troubled. It's from an old friend, a marshal I worked with in Wyoming. He's asking for my help tracking a gang that's been robbing banks across 3 territories. Says he's short-handed and needs someone who knows the country. Hannah sank into the chair opposite him, trying to absorb what this might mean. When would you need to leave? Says to meet him in Denver next week, Hank replied, watching her carefully. But I haven't decided anything yet. Wanted to talk to you first. How long would you be gone? Hannah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Hard to say. Tracking outlaws isn't exactly predictable work. Could be weeks, might be longer. The unspoken question hung between them. Would he go at all with their wedding just weeks away? You're considering it, Hannah said. Not a question, but a statement. Hank ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. Jim saved my life once. I owe him, and I'm good at tracking was one of the best when I wore a badge. And our wedding, Hannah asked quietly, could postpone it, Hank suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Wait till I get back. Hannah was silent for a long moment, studying the face she had come to know so well, the strong jawline, the scar on his cheek, the storm-gray eyes that revealed more than he perhaps realized. She loved this man with all her heart, but she also knew him. Knew the sense of duty that drove him, the restlessness that still lingered beneath his newfound desire to settle. "What do you want to do, Hank?" she asked finally. "Not what you think you should do or what you think I want to hear. What does your heart tell you?" He met her gaze directly. "Part of me wants to go," he admitted, "to help an old friend, to use the skills I have won last time." He reached across the table to take her hand. "But a bigger part wants to stay right here, to marry you as planned and start our life together." Hannah squeezed his hand, making her decision. "Then go," she said simply. "Help your friend do what you need to do. Our wedding can wait until you return." Surprise and relief flickered across Hank's face, followed quickly by doubt. "You sure about that? Don't want you thinking I'm running out on you or that I take our plans lightly." "I'm sure," Hannah said firmly. "I fell in love with you knowing exactly who you are, Hank Edwards. I wouldn't ask you to deny a part of yourself, especially not when someone's life might depend on your help." Hank rounded the table and pulled her to her feet, enfolding her in an embrace so tight it almost hurt. "I don't deserve you," he murmured against her hair. "But I promise you this, I'll come back to you, Hannah. No matter what happens, I'll come back." "I know you will," she whispered, fighting back tears. "And I'll be here waiting." The next few days were a blur of preparations. Hank sent a return telegram to his friend, agreeing to meet him in Denver. He arranged for his few possessions to be stored, spent time ensuring Hannah's home was prepared for winter, and spoke with the livery owner about caring for his horse while he was away. Hannah, meanwhile, notified their friends about the postponement of the wedding. Most were understanding, though she could see the concern in their eyes, the unspoken worry that Hank's departure might be permanent despite his promises. "He'll be back," Hannah told Prudence firmly when her friend expressed her fears. "This is something he needs to do, and I respect that." "You're a stronger woman than most," Prudence replied, squeezing Hannah's hand. "And I pray you're right about him returning." The morning of Hank's departure dawned cold and clear, the first dusting of snow covering the ground like a delicate blanket. Hannah rose early to prepare a hearty breakfast, determined to send him off with a good meal and a brave face despite the ache in her heart. They ate mostly in silence, both aware of the hours slipping away too quickly. When it was time for Hank to leave for the stagecoach, Hannah handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" he asked, turning it over in his hands. "Just a few things you might need," Hannah replied. "Extra bandages, salve for burns, quinine tablets in case of fever, and—" She hesitated, then continued softly, "and a photograph, so you don't forget what I look like while you're away." Hank's expression softened as he tucked the package carefully into his saddlebag. "As if I could forget," he said, cupping her face in his hands. "Your face is etched on my heart, Hannah Elwood. I'll carry it with me every step of the way." They walked together to the stagecoach station, Hank's arm around her shoulders as if he couldn't bear to break contact until the last possible moment. The coach was already waiting, the driver checking harnesses and stamping his feet against the cold. "I love you," Hank said, drawing Hannah into a final embrace. "I'll write when I can, and I'll be back before you know it." "I love you too," Hannah replied, memorizing the feel of him, the scent of leather and pine that always seemed to cling to his clothes. "Be careful out there." "Always am," he promised, then kissed her one last time, a kiss that spoke of longing and promise and the pain of separation. Then he was gone, climbing aboard the stagecoach with a final wave. Hannah stood in the street long after the coach had disappeared from view, the cold wind numbing her face and disguising the tears that finally spilled over. Winter descended on Colorado City with a vengeance in the weeks following Hank's departure. Heavy snows blanketed the town, and bitter winds howled down from the mountains, keeping most people close to home except for necessary errands. Hannah threw herself into her work, spending long hours tending to patients suffering from winter ailments and delivering babies that seemed determined to arrive during the worst blizzards. Letters from Hank came sporadically, carried by whatever travelers managed to make the journey from Denver. His writing was as straightforward as his speech, brief accounts of the search for the outlaws, descriptions of the towns they passed through, and always, at the end of each letter, a declaration of his love and his promise to return as soon as possible. "We've picked up the trail heading toward New Mexico territory," he wrote in early January. "Jim thinks we're gaining on them. With luck, we might have this wrapped up by spring." Spring seemed impossibly far away as Hannah read his words by lamplight, the wind rattling her windows and snow piling up against the door. But she held on to hope, counting the days and taking comfort in the knowledge that every sunset brought Hank one day closer to coming home. February brought illness to Colorado City, a particularly virulent strain of influenza that left Hannah working day and night to care for the afflicted. She moved between homes, treating symptoms and offering what comfort she could, while praying that the epidemic would pass quickly. It was during this exhausting time that Hannah first noticed signs that something might be wrong with her own health. Persistent fatigue, occasional dizziness, and a strange sensitivity to certain smells that had never bothered her before. At first, she attributed these symptoms to overwork and worry about Hank. But when morning sickness began, there was no denying the truth. She was with Hank's child. The realization brought a complex mixture of emotions: joy at the new life growing within her, fear about facing pregnancy without Hank by her side, and uncertainty about how he would react to the news. They had spoken of children in abstract terms, both agreeing they wanted a family someday. But they had not planned for someday to arrive quite so soon. After confirming her condition, Hannah debated whether to include the news in her next letter to Hank. Part of her wanted to share her joy immediately. Another part worried that such news might distract him at a time when his full attention needed to be on his dangerous work. In the end, she decided to wait. The baby wouldn't arrive until late summer or early fall, and with luck, Hank would be home long before then. She would tell him in person, see the expression on his face when he learned he was to be a father. This decision made, Hannah continued her work, though she became more careful about getting proper rest and nutrition. The only person she confided in was Prudence, who was overjoyed at the news and immediately appointed herself Hannah's protector. "You're working far too hard," Prudence scolded one evening in March when she found Hannah asleep at her desk, medical texts open before her. "That baby needs you healthy, and so does Hank when he returns." "I can't neglect my patients," Hannah protested, though she allowed herself to be led to the sofa. "Especially now that the worst of the influenza seems to be passing. The town survived before you came, and it will survive if you take an afternoon off now and then," Prudence insisted. "Now, I've brought soup, and you're going to eat every bite while I tell you about the letter I received from my cousin in Denver." Prudence's chatter was a welcome distraction, and Hannah found herself relaxing as her friend described the latest fashions and gossip from the territorial capital. but her attention snapped back when Prudence mentioned something unexpected. "And Martha writes that there's been quite a commotion over a gang of bank robbers that was captured last week. Apparently there was a terrible gunfight, and one of the marshals was killed." Hannah's heart froze. "A marshal was killed. Did your cousin say which one?" Prudence frowned, trying to recall. "I don't believe she mentioned a name, only that the outlaws were finally caught after months of pursuit, and that there had been casualties on both sides." "May I see the letter?" Hannah asked, her voice tight with fear. "Of course, but it's at home. I'll bring it by tomorrow." Prudence studied Hannah's pale face with growing concern. "You don't think? Surely Hank wasn't involved in that particular chase." "He was helping a marshal friend track bank robbers," Hannah said, her hands instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. "His last letter said they were closing in, but that was nearly a month ago." Prudence reached over to squeeze her hand. "Try not to worry. There are many lawmen in the territories, and many outlaw gangs. The odds that Hank was involved in this particular incident are small." But Hannah couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over her. That night, after Prudence left, she paced her small parlor, one hand resting protectively over the child growing within her, the other clutching Hank's last letter like a talisman. "Come back to me," she whispered to the empty room. "Please, Hank, come back to us." The next morning dawned bright and clear, the March sun beginning to melt the snow that had covered the ground for months. Hannah had just finished breakfast when a knock came at her door. Her heart leapt, hope surging through her veins. Could it be? But when she opened the door, it was Sheriff Mills who stood on her porch, his expression grave, his hat in his hands. Behind him stood a man she didn't recognize, tall and official looking in a marshal's coat. "Dr. Elwood," the sheriff said formally. "This is Marshal Thomas from Denver. He has news about Hank Edwards." Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. She gripped the doorframe to steady herself. "What news?" she managed to ask, though she feared she already knew the answer from their solemn expressions. "May we come in, madam?" Marshal Thomas requested gently. Hannah nodded mutely, stepping back to allow them entry. She led them to her parlor, motioning for them to sit while she remained standing, unable to relax into stillness while dread coiled in her stomach. "Please," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, "tell me what's happened to Hank." Marshal Thomas cleared his throat. "Madam, I regret to inform you that there was an incident during the apprehension of the Wilson gang last week. Mr. Edwards was assisting Marshal James Harker in tracking these dangerous criminals, and during the confrontation that led to their capture, shots were exchanged." "Was he hurt?" Hannah asked, clinging to the smallest hope. "Is he in a hospital in Denver?" The marshal's eyes filled with sympathy. "I'm deeply sorry, Dr. Elwood. Hank Edwards was struck by multiple bullets while protecting Marshal Harker. He did not survive his injuries." The world seemed to tilt around Hannah. She heard a strange, keening sound and realized dimly that it was coming from her own throat. Strong hands guided her to a chair as her legs gave way beneath her. "No," she whispered. "No, there must be some mistake. He promised he would come back to me." "There's no mistake, Doc," Sheriff Mills said gently. "The marshal here brought Hank's personal effects." He nodded to Thomas, who produced a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. With trembling hands, Hannah accepted the package. Inside, she found Hank's pocket watch, his battered journal, and the photograph she had given him, the one he was supposed to carry until he returned to her. Most devastating of all was her mother's ring, the one he had placed on her finger with such hope and promise. "He died a hero, madam," Marshal Thomas offered. "Saved Jim Harker's life and helped bring a dangerous gang to justice. If it's any comfort, his last words were of you. Ask Jim to make sure you knew he tried to keep his promise." But there was no comfort in those words, no solace to be found in heroism or justice. Hannah felt as though her heart had been torn from her chest, leaving nothing but a raw, gaping wound in its place. "Thank you for bringing these to me," she said mechanically, her doctor's training allowing her to maintain composure even as she shattered inside. Is there a body to be returned?" "He was buried in Denver 3 days ago," Thomas replied. Jim Harker thought it best not to delay, given the distance and conditions. There was a service small but respectful. Hannah nodded, though the thought of Hank being laid to rest without her there, without her even knowing he was gone, was almost more than she could bear. "I see," she said, her voice hollow. "Then there's nothing more to be done." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to her controlled grief. Eventually, they took their leave, Sheriff Mills promising to check on her later and offering any assistance she might need. When they were gone, when the door closed behind them and she was finally alone, Hannah Elwood's composure crumbled like a dam giving way to a flood. She clutched Hank's belongings to her chest and sank to her knees, sobs tearing from her throat as the reality of her loss crashed over her in merciless waves. "You promised," she cried to the empty room. "You promised you'd come back." Hours later, Prudence found her still on the floor, tear-stained and exhausted. Without a word, her friend helped her to bed, bringing tea and sitting beside her through the long night as Hannah drifted between grief-stricken wakefulness and fitful sleep. In the days that followed, Hannah moved through her life like a ghost, performing her duties as doctor by rote while her heart remained numb with loss. The town rallied around her, bringing food, offering condolences, and respecting her need for solitude. It was only the knowledge of the child growing within her that kept Hannah from giving in completely to despair. This baby, this precious part of Hank that she still carried, became her anchor, her reason to continue when all she wanted was to surrender to grief. As spring gradually transformed the land, melting the last of the snow and bringing new growth to the fire-scarred prairie, Hannah made her pregnancy known to the community. The news was met with surprise, then with an outpouring of support that touched her deeply. "Your child will never lack for family," Prudence assured her as they prepared the nursery in what would have been Hank's study. "This whole town will help you raise this baby." "I know," Hannah replied, running her hand over her gently swelling abdomen. "I just wish that Hank could be here," Prudence finished softly. "Of course you do, and he should be. It's not fair, Hannah." "No," Hannah agreed, tears welling in her eyes for what felt like the 1,000th time. "It's not fair at all." Summer arrived, hot and dry, bringing with it memories of the previous year's fire and the man who had ridden through flames to save her. Hannah often found herself at the spot where they had planned their future together, where Hank had placed his mother's ring on her finger and promised to love her forever. She wore that ring now on a chain around her neck, close to her heart, unable to bear seeing it on her finger when the promise it represented had been broken by death rather than choice. As her due date approached, Hannah prepared for the birth with the same methodical care she brought to all aspects of her medical practice. She arranged for another physician from a neighboring town to be available when her time came, set up the nursery with everything a newborn might need, and tried to focus on the joy of meeting her child rather than the sorrow of Hank's absence. It was on a warm September evening, as the first hints of autumn began to color the trees, that Hannah's labor began. True to her word, Prudence stayed by her side throughout the long night, holding her hand through the pain and offering encouragement as Hannah struggled to bring her child into the world. Just as dawn was breaking, with a final powerful push, Hannah delivered a healthy, robust boy. He had a thatch of dark hair like his father's, and when he finally opened them, eyes of a stormy gray that brought fresh tears to Hannah's eyes. "He looks like Hank," Prudence whispered as she placed the swaddled infant in Hannah's arms. "Yes," Hannah agreed, studying her son's tiny features with wonder and heartache intermingled. "He does." When the visiting doctor asked what name she had chosen, Hannah didn't hesitate. "Harrison," she said firmly. "Harrison Thomas Edwards, after his father." The days and weeks that followed were a blur of exhaustion and adjustment as Hannah learned to balance her medical practice with the demands of motherhood. Young Harry, as he came to be called, proved to be a good-natured baby, quick to smile and slow to fuss, with a curious gaze that seemed to take in everything around him. Hannah found that the acute pain of her grief began to soften in the presence of her son. It didn't disappear. She doubted it ever would, but it transformed into something she could carry while still finding joy in the new life she and Hank had created together. Autumn deepened, the anniversary of the Prairie fire, and her first meeting with Hank approaching with inexorable steadiness. Hannah found herself both dreading and longing for the date, knowing it would bring both precious memories and renewed pain. On the evening of that anniversary, after settling Harry in his cradle, Hannah wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped onto her porch. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and stars glittered overhead in a velvet sky. "I miss you," she whispered, her words carried away by the gentle breeze. "Every day I miss you. But I want you to know that our son is beautiful and strong, and I'll make sure he knows how brave his father was, how much you were loved, how much you loved us." As if in response to her words, a shooting star blazed across the heavens, brief but brilliant in its passage. Hannah smiled through her tears, choosing to see it as a sign, a message from beyond that Hank somehow knew about his son, about the life that continued in his absence. She was about to turn back inside when the sound of hoofbeats in the distance caught her attention. A rider was approaching from the east, silhouetted against the rising moon. Something about the figure's outline, the way he sat his horse, sent a tremor of recognition through Hannah's body before her mind could process what she was seeing. The rider drew closer, guiding his horse directly toward her home with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going. When he reached her gate, he dismounted slowly, as if weary from a long journey. Hannah stood frozen on her porch, certain she was dreaming or hallucinating or perhaps finally losing her mind to grief. It couldn't be, it was impossible, and yet. "Hannah," the figure called softly, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air, a voice she had heard in her dreams for months. A voice she had never expected to hear again in this lifetime. "Hank," she whispered, her hands gripping the porch railing as her legs threatened to give way. "Is it really you?" He stepped into the light spilling from her window, and Hannah's heart stopped. The face she loved beyond reason, the storm-gray eyes she saw every day in their son's gaze, the scar along his cheekbone, all unchanged, all impossibly, miraculously present. "It's me," Hank Edwards said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm home, Hannah. I've come back to you." Hannah flew down the porch steps and across the yard, heedless of the cool night air or her state of undress. She half expected him to vanish like smoke when she reached him, a cruel trick of her desperate mind. But when her hands touched his chest, he was solid and warm and real. "How?" she gasped, her fingers clutching at his shirt as if afraid he might disappear again. "They told me you were dead. The marshal brought your things." Hank's arms encircled her, holding her close as his own tears fell unchecked. "I nearly was," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "Took 3 bullets trying to protect Jim. They thought I wouldn't make it. Hell, I thought I wouldn't make it. Sent my things to you because they were sure I was dying." "But you didn't die," Hannah whispered, still scarcely able to believe what her senses were telling her. No, Hank agreed. Though it was touch and go for weeks. By the time I was conscious again, word had already been sent to you that I was gone. I tried to get messages to you as soon as I could, but the first 2 riders I sent never made it through. One turned back because of flooding. The other was robbed on the trail. Hannah pulled back just far enough to see his face, her hands reaching up to trace the beloved features she had thought lost to her forever. Why didn't Marshal Thomas know you were alive when he came to tell me you were dead? He left Denver before I regained consciousness, Hank explained. Jim Harker knew I was alive, but he was recovering from his own injuries in a different town. By the time everyone sorted out what had happened, I was determined to tell you myself rather than send another message that might not reach you. So you've been alive all this time, Hannah said, wonder and joy beginning to replace the shock. All these months I've been grieving, thinking I'd lost you forever. I'm so sorry, Hannah, Hank said, his eyes full of pain at what she had endured. I tried to get back to you as quickly as I could, but the wounds were bad. Took months before I could even sit a horse, and then the journey itself. He shook his head. Felt like every obstacle possible was thrown in my path, but nothing could keep me from returning to you. Nothing. Hannah's mind was racing, trying to absorb this miracle, this second chance she had never dared to hope for, and then she remembered Harry. Hank, she said, taking his hand. There's something you need to know, someone you need to meet. Confusion flickered across his face as she led him toward the house. Someone. Hannah paused at the door, her heart full to bursting. When you left, I didn't know. We didn't know. She took a deep breath. Hank, we have a son, born just 3 weeks ago. Hank stared at her, stunned disbelief giving way to overwhelming joy. A son, he repeated, his voice breaking. We have a son, Hannah nodded, tears streaming down her face. His name is Harrison, after his father. We call him Harry. Without another word, she led Hank into the house and to the small nursery where their son slept peacefully, unaware of the miracle unfolding around him. Hank approached the cradle with reverence, his steps faltering slightly, still weak from his injuries and overcome with emotion. When he looked down at the sleeping infant, a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob escaped him. He's perfect, he whispered. Absolutely perfect. He has your eyes, Hannah told him, watching as Hank gently touched their son's tiny hand. And your stubbornness already, I think. Poor child, Hank said with a watery smile. Then he turned to Hannah, gathering her in his arms once more. I'm so sorry I wasn't here for you for his birth, if I had known. You're here now, Hannah said simply. That's all that matters. They stood together beside their son's cradle, holding each other as the full weight of their reunion washed over them. The grief and loneliness of the past months, the despair Hannah had fought daily, the pain and struggle Hank had endured to return to her, all of it paled in comparison to the joy of this moment, this second chance at the life they had planned together. Later, as they sat before the fire in Hannah's parlor, Hank recounted the full story of his near-death experience and the long road to recovery. Hannah told him of her pregnancy, of carrying their child alone while believing him dead, of the support the town had shown her in her time of need. I never stopped loving you, Hank told her, holding her close as the fire burned low. Even when I thought I might die, my last thoughts were of you, of getting back to you somehow. And now you have, Hannah said, her head resting on his shoulder. Though I'm still half afraid I'll wake up and find this was all a dream. Not a dream, Hank assured her, his lips brushing her forehead. I'm real and I'm here to stay, if you'll still have me, that is. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. I managed to get this back from Marshal Thomas before I left Denver. In his palm lay a simple gold band, his mother's ring, the symbol of their engagement that Hannah had returned with his other effects. "Hannah Elwood," Hank said, his voice solemn despite the joy in his eyes. "I promised once to love you for the rest of my life, and that promise still holds. Will you marry me? Soon, this time, before anything else can happen to delay our happiness." Hannah laughed through her tears, extending her hand. "Yes," she said as he slipped the ring back onto her finger where it belonged. "As soon as possible." They were married 2 weeks later in Colorado City's small church, with Harry cradled in his mother's arms throughout the ceremony. The entire town turned out for the occasion, celebrating not only the union of their doctor and the man who had saved her from the fire, but the miracle of his return from what everyone had believed was certain death. Even Sheriff Mills seemed genuinely pleased, shaking Hank's hand at the reception with what appeared to be sincere goodwill. "You're a lucky man, Edwards," he said gruffly. "That woman and child of yours are special." "Don't I know it?" Hank agreed, his eyes seeking Hannah across the room where she stood with Prudence, their son sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the festivities surrounding him. "Never thought I'd be fortunate enough to have a family of my own. Now I can't imagine life without them." "What will you do now?" the sheriff asked. "Got plans to move on, or are you sticking around Colorado City?" Hank smiled, no hesitation in his answer. "This is home now, Sheriff. My wandering days are over." True to his word, Hank Edwards put down roots in Colorado City. He partnered with the aging livery owner, eventually taking over the business when the older man retired. His skill with horses became legendary in the region, and people began to bring difficult animals from miles around for Hank to gentle and train. Hannah continued her medical practice, though she scaled back her hours somewhat to spend more time with her growing family. Harry was joined 2 years later by a sister, Elizabeth, a spirited girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's adventurous nature. Their home expanded as their family grew, with Hank adding rooms to the building above Hannah's medical office, until it became one of the most comfortable residences in town. The garden Hannah planted flourished under her care, providing fresh herbs for her medical preparations and flowers that brightened their table through the summer months. On warm evenings, they would often sit on their porch watching their children play, marveling at the life they had built together from the ashes of near tragedy. "You ever miss it?" Hannah asked Hank once as they observed 7-year-old Harry teaching his 5-year-old sister how to throw a lasso, a skill Hank had passed down to his son. The open road, the freedom of not being tied down. Hank considered the question, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Not for a moment," he said honestly. "What I have here, you, the children, our home, it's worth more than all the freedom in the world." Hannah leaned into his embrace, contentment washing over her. "Even when Harry is being stubborn and Elizabeth is climbing trees she shouldn't." "Even then," Hank chuckled, "maybe especially then." Their conversation was interrupted by excited shouts as the children abandoned their game and ran toward a figure approaching on horseback, Prudence Davis, returning from a trip to Denver with her new husband, a businessman she had met during a visit to the territorial capital. "Auntie Prue," Elizabeth called, racing ahead of her brother. "Did you bring us presents?" "Elizabeth," Hannah admonished gently, "that's not a proper greeting." But Prudence just laughed, dismounting to sweep the little girl into her arms. "Of course I brought presents, you greedy little magpie. But first, I have news you'll all want to hear." She joined them on the porch, accepting the glass of lemonade Hannah offered gratefully. "The territorial governor has finally approved funding for a proper hospital in Colorado City," she announced proudly. "And guess who they want to serve as chief physician?" Hannah stared at her friend in shock. "Me, but I'm just a country doctor." "You're the best doctor in 3 counties," Prudence corrected, "and everyone knows it. The governor's wife hasn't forgotten how you saved her sister when she was visiting last year. She personally recommended you for the position." Hannah turned to Hank, her eyes wide with surprise and excitement. "A hospital here in Colorado City. It would mean more work, more responsibility, but also better care for so many people who need it." "You should accept," Hank said without hesitation. "It's what you've always wanted, isn't it? A chance to practice medicine with proper facilities to train others. But the children, our home." "We'll manage," Hank assured her, "just like we always have, together." As the sun set over the prairie that had nearly claimed her life, and instead had given her everything she held dear, Hannah Elwood Edwards looked at her family, the husband who had ridden through fire to save her, the children who filled their days with joy, the friend who had stood by her through the darkest times and knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. "Together," she agreed, reaching for Hank's hand as the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. "Always together." And so they remained, through all the seasons of their lives, their love born in flames growing only stronger with the passage of time, a beacon of hope and resilience in the wild heart of the West, a testament to the courage it takes not just to ride through fire, but to build a life from what remains when the flames have died away.